Imagine being arrested for something so small, something that seems so insignificant. But when it goes to court, it becomes a case that shocks the nation. A homeless man gets arrested for loitering, but the real story behind his arrest isn't what anyone expected. What happens next will change the way we view the justice system, homelessness, and how we treat our veterans. Trust me, this story will leave you speechless. We all know that the justice system is supposed to be fair. But what happens when the system fails the very people it was designed to protect? When a homeless man is arrested for a minor crime, everyone thinks they know the story. But when this case went to court, it turned into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. This is the story of Michael, a homeless man who was arrested for loitering in a public park. But what happened in court was something that not only shocked everyone in the room, but also sparked a nationwide conversation. This is the untold truth about his arrest, and the shocking way it turned out. Scene set up: Michael's struggles. The city was alive with its usual energy, the rush of cars, the sound of hurried footsteps, and the hum of life as people rushed by, each with their own worries. Among them, sitting quietly on a park bench, was Michael. His clothes were frayed, his shoes worn through, and his face, weathered by time, told a story of years of struggle. Michael hadn't always been this way. In fact, there was a time when he was a hero. A decade ago, he had proudly served in the military, fighting in wars abroad, doing what his country had asked of him. But when he came home, the world was a different place. Michael had returned to a country that seemed to have forgotten him. The support that was promised to veterans never arrived. The trauma from his time in the service lingered. PTSD, depression, and anxiety took hold of him. He couldn't find steady work. His relationships with family and friends strained, eventually leading him to the streets. Michael wasn't just homeless, he was broken, struggling to find his place in a world that no longer seemed to care. But that morning, as he sat on the park bench, Michael wasn't thinking about his past. He wasn't thinking about the battles he'd fought overseas or the way the world had turned its back on him. He was simply exhausted. His mind and body were worn thin. All he wanted was to rest. The arrest, the officer's perspective. Officer Thompson had patrolled these streets for over a decade. He was used to seeing homeless people in the park, scattered around like forgotten pieces of the city. Loitering laws were clear. If you were caught sitting in public spaces without a purpose, you could be asked to move or face arrest. He had done it countless times before. But when he saw Michael that morning, something felt different. Officer Thompson had seen the man many times before. Michael was a regular in the park. His rough exterior, his worn-down appearance, the way he sat there, almost lifeless, made him stand out. Thompson had become used to people like Michael, the ones who refused to follow society's rules, the ones who seemed to have given up. He wasn't thinking of Michael as a person. To the officer, Michael was just another figure to move along. "Hey," Thompson called out as he walked toward the bench, "you need to move. You can't just sit here." Michael didn't respond immediately. His gaze was distant, his mind fogged with exhaustion. He had heard it all before. "I'm just resting," Michael muttered weakly, barely looking up. Thompson's patience was wearing thin. "Resting doesn't mean breaking the law. You've got to move. You can't stay here indefinitely." Michael didn't have the energy to argue. "Where else am I supposed to go?" he asked quietly, but the question hung in the air unanswered. Within minutes, Michael was handcuffed, placed in the back of the squad car, and taken in for a minor loitering charge. To Officer Thompson, this was just another routine arrest. To Michael, it was another moment of the system failing him, another step in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. The turning point, Michael's history, revealed. The case seemed like it would be just another typical one, a minor infraction that would be brushed aside. But when it went to court, it became clear that this was no ordinary case. As the trial began, the courtroom filled with anticipation. The prosecutor presented the case: a homeless man breaking the law, a public nuisance, a disruption to society. He painted Michael as a criminal, someone who was lazy and careless, unwilling to take responsibility for his actions. But Michael's defense attorney, Sarah, wasn't about to let that narrative stand. Sarah was young, eager, and driven by a sense of justice that went beyond the basics. She knew this case wasn't just about Michael. It was about something bigger. It was about the system that had let down so many people. People who had fought for their country, only to return to a life filled with hardship and rejection. Sarah stood up and started her argument, her voice calm but filled with determination. "This man," she said, pointing to Michael, "is not just a homeless man. He is a war veteran, a man who served his country proudly, only to return to a world that has failed him." The courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of his case, paused, his confidence now wavering. Sarah continued, "Michael has fought in wars. He has faced horrors that most of us will never understand. He was promised care, promised support when he came back home. Instead, he found himself forgotten. Without proper mental health care, without a steady job, he was forced onto the streets. The arrest you see here is not about a man loitering. It's about a broken system." The shocking testimony. Michael speaks. The most emotional part of the trial came when Michael himself was called to the stand. He was reluctant at first, his hands shaking, his voice barely above a whisper. But Sarah encouraged him, and slowly he began to speak. "I didn't choose to be like this," Michael said, his eyes downcast. "I didn't choose to lose everything. But after everything I've seen, everything I've done, I don't know where else to go. I fought for this country, and now I'm left on the streets." His words, raw and emotional, struck the entire courtroom. The prosecutor, who had once seen Michael as a nuisance, was now speechless. The judge, a man who had seen hundreds of cases come through his court, was visibly moved. "Why didn't anyone help me?" Michael asked, his voice cracking. "I gave everything, and now I'm nothing." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. People who had watched Michael's life unfold before them began to understand the depth of his struggle. He wasn't just a statistic. He was a man, a person who had given everything and now had nothing. The verdict: a nation reacts. As the trial came to a close, the judge took some time to deliberate. The verdict that followed stunned everyone. Instead of a traditional sentencing, the judge ruled that Michael would be placed into a comprehensive rehabilitation program. This program would provide him with the therapy and support he needed for PTSD, mental health counseling, job placement assistance, and housing. But that wasn't all. The judge also ordered the city to launch an investigation into the treatment of veterans, specifically focusing on homelessness and mental health care. But the shock didn't stop there. The case was covered by news outlets nationwide. People from all walks of life began to rally behind Michael, demanding that something be done to address the systemic failures that had led to his situation. Activists, veterans, and everyday citizens flooded the streets in support of better care for homeless veterans and mental health services. Michael's case became a turning point, a symbol of how the system had failed not just him, but countless others who had fallen through the cracks. Conclusion: the impact. The case was far from over. It sparked a nationwide debate about how veterans were treated when they returned home from service, and whether the government was doing enough to help those who had given so much for their country. Michael was given a second chance. His rehabilitation program was a start, but it would take time. He began to rebuild his life, and though the road ahead was still long, it was no longer a road he had to walk alone. This story isn't just about Michael. It's about everyone who has fallen through the cracks. It's about the veterans who have served and sacrificed only to be abandoned by the very system they fought for. It's about the homeless, the forgotten, the ones who need our help the most. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the judge made the right call? How can we as a society do better for those who have given everything for us? Like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge the way we see the world.